I feel the pressure for the headline act. But yeah, so I'm going to talk about next steps in sustainability. As introduced, yeah, Ollie Fuller, director at Vida Design, so we're MEP sustainability consultants, and we sort of, sustainability-led MEP consultants. So my first slide, and I think a lot of this is probably going over some of the things that Ray and Phil also already covered, but interestingly, when you talk about next steps of sustainability, AI is a key attribute to it. So what I thought, I would ask AI to do this for me. So I've asked AI, what are the next steps in sustainability? And interestingly, it's not bad. It's got a not bad effort at it. But what I'd quite like to emphasize is probably this first statement at the top. Because interestingly, I think we talk a lot about net zero and carbon emissions, but actually it is about well-being, and it's also about the planet and health and resilience and inclusiveness. So it's not just about carbon. And I think that's sometimes forgotten, and it's that balance between everything that we're trying to achieve. Don't want to go through the list too much, but it's very much about using resources wisely. So things like circular economy now, can we reuse materials and other bits, coming into the embodied carbon question that Phil went through. Zero emissions, so from a background of myself, we're very much, my background is sustainability, but it's very much about building performance, operational energy. That's probably my expertise and where I'm coming from. So zero emissions, and I'll come on to some of these points in more details as we go through. Fairness for all, so sustainable buildings that everyone can access. We talked about cost. If you make things too expensive and too achievable, and we see it all the time, high-end residential, they've got 5 houses around the world, they've got helicopters, planes, they want a net zero carbon house, and you kind of go, well, how often you can live into it? Oh, I don't know, one weekend in a year. And you're kind of like, oh, it doesn't quite add up. Prepare for climate change. So again, as well as sort of net zero carbon, we've got the climate change, climate resilience, overheating, excess rainfall that we've all experienced over the last few months, and glad hopefully we're getting to the end of. Healthy spaces, so again, this comes on to that sort of well-being. Working together. Architects, builders, governments, I think this is the thing. I think design teams work well together, and then you've got to linking up with the governments and wider funders and everything else are all on the same lines. Smart use of tech, again, comes back to the AI and other things around that. Supportive rules. So policy, we all love a good policy, we all love a good regulation. And interestingly, I would say my last sort of 15 years in sustainability, the beginning part of my career, I was a sustainability consultant, but when everyone came to me, it was about finding loopholes. It was a developer saying, need to do this, how do I not do that? And as a specialist, you would help them not do sustainability measures, which is an interesting thing. And I think you've got to be very careful that if you put too much pressure on people, they get defensive and they want to try and get out of it. And investing in green. So this is something we're seeing more and more. It comes down to basically funders. Whereas previously it wasn't linked to initiatives. We talked about Wales, everything needs to be net zero carbon, and the funding's on the back of it. We're seeing now, for example, that you have to have an EPCA to get funding, or you need to get BREEAM or other measures to achieve it. So it is coming in, whether developers and other clients and things like it or not, there's other pressures starting to creep in on them. Something that you guys covered that I also want to cover is something that I find quite confusing and interesting when it comes to next steps of sustainability is the definitions and terminology used. And one thing I wanted to go over, sort of to have in your mindset as we go through this, is the terminology climate emergency. So we talk about this 1.5 degrees. Reality, you look at a lot of reports, we've already gone past the tipping point. So it's all about climate emergency. What do we do now? That's in the next less than 5 years. So actually, looking at sustainable to long term is the wrong approach, because actually it doesn't matter what you do in 10, 15 years. It's all about reducing carbon now. So it's an interesting thing, and you see lots of arguments in our industry choose which side of that fence they want to be, depending on what they want to do. For example, if you want to build a building out of concrete, you look at the long term. And you say actually over a long period of time, it's more sustainable, it'll be around for 200 years, we can reuse it and adapt it. If you look at the climate emergency, actually you suddenly go down a timber route. So it's interesting how, depending on how you interpret the definitions, and this is the thing at the moment, it's not really clear when someone says, I want to be net zero, or I want to do stuff, it's not really clear where you sit at the fence, and actually what are we targeting going forward. And again, it's the same as refurb versus new build. I listened to a really interesting talk about the new Premier Inn that's been converted that Savills did, and they had some fantastic graphs saying why they knocked the building down and they're doing a new build. And it's very easy to make those graphs look whichever way. You could easily have done the graph completely the other way and had this different argument. And at the moment, we're very much in that grounds of there's no real clear direction, and it's confusing for all. So I think that's what sort of comes on to my next one. As I mentioned, I think most organisations and people jumped on the bandwagon of this climate emergency. They declared a climate emergency and said, I want to be net zero by 2050. I want to be net zero by 2030. And now they're all trying to work out, what does that mean? How do I achieve that? And then they suddenly look at it and go, well, actually, let's change the definition slightly to make it easier for me to achieve it or to get to that target. And at the moment, there's no real clear guidance on what that actually means. And you see so many different things. You've got carbon neutrality, you've got net zero carbon, and we've mentioned UK Green Building Council. They're actually teaming up with the likes of RIC, CIBSE and lots of organisations. Actually, they're doing some really good stuff to try and come up with a definition. So there was a 2019 definition that kind of set a framework and said this is what we think it should be, and they're updating it. So there's another one coming out this year, which is an updated version. But the problem is, will there be another version and then another version and another version? So it's quite hard to understand what it actually means, and will that be changing? Something I've highlighted in big red is offsetting. So offsetting is a really interesting one, because any organisation can be net zero tomorrow if you offset yourself. So you don't need to do anything other than offset your carbon. And the definitions around what class is offsetting and the regulation around it is very poor. So you might drive down the road, you see a development and it's completely net zero carbon because they've decided under their definition that is the case. So it's a tricky one, and this is something that I think we've got someone from a lighting manufacturer. We were speaking to a lighting manufacturer and they were saying, to be honest, until regulation makes it clear and even, we don't necessarily want to go forward with things because we feel like we'll be unfairly prosecuted. A client we've done quite a lot of work with is UE, and I quite like this because what they've started to do is actually to basically describe what they're doing, and I think that's quite important. So they've said, okay, we've signed up to be net zero by 2030, but what they've done is then described how they're going to achieve that and what that actually means, so it's that clarity behind what they're doing, and I think that's good, and it's a good step forward. Next thing is regulatory requirements. So I think in some of the previous slides we talked about 2024, but there's also a lot happening in 2025, and I think it's probably all linked together. So you've got the Future Home Standards. Everyone know what the Future Home Standards is or come across it? So basically they've looked at SAP calculations, which is basically for residential domestic properties, and said this isn't really working, let's come up with a completely new standard. And this is the Future Home Standard. So it will be similar, but it's going to replace SAP, and it's going to be net zero carbon ready. I'm not quite sure what that means, but it sounds good. And it's going to be a 78% reduction over current Part L. I realised I made a typo, that should be Part Z, not Part X. So, so you've got the Future Home Standards coming, which is also linked with Part L. You've also got other standards that are coming in now. You've got Part O, again, which is more on the well-being side, so that looks at thermal comfort, overheating, so that is now a regulation where previously it wasn't. And then you've got Part Z, which is coming in, which is looking at the embodied carbon side. EPC ratings, so many things at the moment. Funding's linked to EPC ratings. You've got the minimum energy efficiency standards, whether you can sell or you can buy a property, is linked to EPC ratings. They've decided now, as part of this Future Home Standard review, that they're going to potentially change the methodology of how that's done and how it's done. So you can understand with a developer, you say, okay, let's have an EPC on my properties, and suddenly you find in a couple of years' time, actually you were an A, but now you're a C, or vice versa. So I think the industry really needs to sort of stick to something, go with it, and go forward with it. And I think it will help. Planning's an interesting one. I don't know if anyone's been to any planning talks recently, but you basically have your national planning policy framework, which is like your sort of national requirements. And then you have your local policies. So you've got your Bristol one, and you've got Let's Talk About Bath. So Bath wants to be net zero, wants to be able to pass those. The reality at the moment that seems to be coming through the courts is they're not necessarily able to enforce going beyond the national planning policy framework. So it's fantastic you've got these councils pushing beyond it, but actually there's potential that they can't legally do that. And this is being challenged in the courts and coming out at the moment. But again, it causes confusion, it causes loopholes and other bits. Something that has been in the industry for a while and came out through like the car manufacturer is performance gap. So we've probably all heard about performance gap, and this is one of the reasons why Passive House and other standards have come through. So there's a lot more operational energy modelling now, and lots more acronyms of TM54, which is a CIBSE standard that you'll come to use, but it's actually understanding how much does a building actually use rather than using a Partel model that's based on a lot of assumptions and not necessarily applicable. So there's lots of regulatory requirements coming in. 2025 is due to be quite a big change and an update in that, and hopefully there'll be plenty of warning on what's coming and getting to that as well. So we talked about climate resilience, and this is sort of going into probably a bit more sort of detail on what we're finding in the market. So climate resilience, we're now having to look at future weather files. Interestingly, some of the last year's temperatures weren't far off the future weather files of 2080 when you look at temperatures. If you look at London now, the temperatures within London, it's very hard to have a naturally ventilated building. It's virtually impossible to have it within those standards when you do the thermal modelling. So you're automatically looking at providing cooling. So if you're looking at residential blocks, student accommodation, anything like that, you're virtually going towards the fact is you do need some element of cooling within that building to pass. And also you've got things like acoustic restraints now. So they're looking at lots of studies on sleeping. If temperatures are over a certain amount and it's noisy, you won't open your window, therefore you get hot at night. So also that's taken out, and also air quality. So what you're finding is buildings before that could be naturally ventilated, we're very much going down the route of we need cooling and we need mechanical ventilation as background ventilation within it. So you can see how things have moved on and advancing as more standards come in. Here's a bit more sort of probably looking at some of the things that are coming out. So technology, it's amazing how much people evolve to suit the market, and I think that's something we need to take into consideration, how much things do move to sort of to fit that gap. So nowadays what you can do, and a number of projects we're looking at, is you can have a combined unit, which is a hot water cylinder, mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, and a heat pump all in one. So this will provide you with your fresh air, provide you with heating and cooling and hot water. But the nice thing is, for example, if you look at the scenario, cooling is deemed as really bad, but actually if you're producing cooling in the summer and you have a hot water demand, when your heat pump produces cooling, it also provides waste heat that can also go into the hot water. So actually the energy difference isn't that much, and actually it's more about the fabric of the building and other elements that reduce your energy. But I think things like this are going to become more normal, where we're used to just having a naturally ventilated building. We're going to have more things like cooling and designing to these standards. It's quite an interesting thing about grid decarbonisation and how much all of you know about this. This is from 2009 to 2024. So in the red there, you can see here, this is coal. So we were using a lot of coal up to sort of 2016. You can see that's reduced right down. A lot of that was converted into natural gas, which is the blue. And as you can see, things like offshore wind has massively grown, and also solar to fill those gaps. But what you can see is we're still very reliant on natural gas within that. The bottom graph here is the carbon intensity. So we talk about a lot of the way we move forward is about and using heat pumps and not using fossil fuels is all to do with the fact is the grid is decarbonising. But the nice thing about this graph, it does show you that actually the grid has decarbonised a lot already. So actually the trajectory of that isn't too bad and the way we're going. So we're going down. So it does make sense that we are moving away from fossil fuels, we are moving to electricity. This is the last week, so it shows you the breakdown over a week, a bit more detail. The interesting thing is, what you can see is, as we move away from coal and natural gas and we have more renewables, the problem is they fluctuate a lot. So it's not very reliable, and that's a big thing for the energy distributors, is the fact is it's not reliable energy. So therefore you always need the gas to be there to be able to fill in the gaps for it. So is there a way around that? So some of the innovation, energy storage is becoming a big thing. So for example, you have a lot of wind energy, you have a lot of solar energy. So what they're saying is, and you see this, and actually the SAP calculations now take this into account, and it makes quite a big difference in those, is can people within the houses, and it's sort of going back probably a few years, you've got things like modern storage heaters, so you can actually store energy. And you see it through, I've got here Octopus. So Octopus now do quite a few flexible tariffs. We've got smart meters and things like that. So what you'll find is you'll be charged depending on the time of day you use electricity. So actually if you want to save money, and I talked about costs being very important as well as carbon, and actually if both can go hand in hand, it makes a big difference. But if people can store energy and then use it at the right time when the carbon's lower and the cost is lower, it makes things more beneficial. And we're starting to get a point now with the way that tariffs are coming out. Previously, it was always a standard fixed tariff. It didn't matter when you use your energy. It didn't really make much difference, whereas now it is becoming more of a norm. So you will see things like this and the benefits of these things come in. So you've got the bottom there is a SunOut, which is a thermal store. So that's basically storing energy that could be used for heating or hot water at a different time, so you can build it up when it's cheap at night or when the sun's shining, and you can do that and then you can reuse it. You've got your sort of Tesla Powerwall battery storage, and then you've got sort of modern storage heaters now, which are a lot better than the old storage heaters that ran out after sort of half an hour. So I can definitely see things going back to this more, can we store energy, can we use energy at the right times? And I think this will go to your appliances as well. You'll have smart fridges and other things that will be able to work with those systems and actually split that over time. And also the fact is well, not all of us, but things like electric cars, if you think you've basically got a battery with you, you're going to drive home, you're going to plug it into your house, and actually at 6 o'clock when you've got your peak heating demands, you could be using a battery from your car and reducing your bills. This is talking about the mix, so we go back to the sort of grid decarbonisation. Interestingly, you see here, so this was from today at 12 o'clock. So you can say our mix was made up of 10.9 gigawatts was from gas. Interestingly, we're still using coal, which is actually in the Midlands and the Black Country. So coal's still going and we're still reliant on it. So the gas, and then you've got the more renewables. So you've got your wind here, and then you've got your solar. It was a reasonably sunny day this morning, so solar was doing well. You've then got your nuclear, and then actually we import from France, Norway, Belgium, we import energy as well. But as you can see, this accounts for 28% of our generation mix. However, when you look at it in carbon terms, that's 73%. So you can understand why we're trying to get away from our reliance on gas. And also the reality, a lot of our gas comes from, which I'll go into, comes from areas like Russia, Ukraine, and things like that. So when you're looking at energy security, it's something that's sort of incentivized to reduce the carbon in our grid as well as energy security. They both go hand in hand. And this shows the graph. So this is our natural gas costs. So this graph shows us, it was all quite steady, and then we hit COVID. When we came out of COVID, that caused a massive surge in demand and then increase the cost. But what happened next was then the war in Ukraine. And you can see how much has gone up. But you can see the volatility of the gas market because of external influences that affects the government, affects everything. So it's gone from 75, we'll say 100, and it's gone up to over 600. You can see how much. So when you look at cost of living crisis and everything else, you can understand where it's coming from. And the problem is, because our grid is still relies on natural gas, that affects our electricity costs. And interestingly, when you look at your domestic natural gas, that was protected through price increases and things like that. So they were shielded from that price increase. Grid decarbonisation. So what's happening around this? So I don't know if everyone knows about the connection from Morocco. So Morocco has got a big solar power station, and what they're doing is there going to be 4,000 kilometres of cable connecting to Devon, and that will provide us with 3.6 gigawatts of electricity, and they're saying that it will be consistent for 19 hours because basically you've got a massive solar farm and lots of battery and energy storage there, so they can provide it on demand. Interestingly, this power station is actually about 13 gigawatts in total size, so we're only taking proportion of that through, but if you think about the infrastructure and things like that, but it's all to do with security and moving away from gas. And the other one everyone's probably aware of, at some point Hinkley Point C will come online in nuclear, and that will also help decarbonise and help reduce that reliance on natural gas as things coming up. So talking about sort of going back to probably more local things, innovation, smart controls and things like that. So I think a lot of people here in this room, second to you, do a lot with like student accommodation and other bits and things like that. So there's some real simple things that are coming to the market actually make a massive difference, but they don't necessarily show up in modelling. If you did like a Partel model or something else, it doesn't really take this type of technology into account, and that's where actually the real world scenario and looking at it makes a huge difference. So you've got smart controls, really simple controls that will basically have temperature control, but they will also have, so look at a typical student accommodation room where a student comes in and is basically in there overnight. In the morning, they leave their window open, they go out, and it's middle of the winter. So this detection it will detect a drop in temperature, and it will put the heating on a setback. So suddenly saving a lot of energy. And it's quite a simple thing, but it's really, really helpful. And when you're comparing it to like an old traditional radiator with thermostat or something like that, it's really effective controls. It's quite simple. It's easy to install because it basically links to like electric panel heaters and things like that. So it's really innovative, simple. It's not linked to complicated BMS systems that only one person in Switzerland can control and come out and sort out. So you're finding that innovation and these sort of things are moving forward, and they actually make a big difference. And I would say that makes a big real life difference, not necessarily an energy modelling difference. And I think that's something we need to be aware of when making decisions. Also, a big issue we've had is if you're building a big block of flats, for example, you have this requirement to put PV on the roof, but how do the tenants actually benefit from the PV? Previously, we've always just connected the PV back into the landlord supply, and you might have a couple of lights, a couple of little panel heaters somewhere, and it would then just go back into the grid. There's companies now like SolShare. What they're allowing you to do is actually have basically a clever brain control system that can take that PV and it will split it and divide it to the tenants, so the tenants can actually benefit from that solar. And again, that links into actually the EPCs and things as well. So there's technology innovation coming in to meet these requirements. This is my very simple solution to our problem. So if we move away from fossil fuels, the grid decarbonises, and the supply chain does everything for us, and when we buy a product, it's already net zero. And if we do all that, it's easy. As you imagine, it's not quite as simple as that. But interestingly, what I would say is it's amazing how quick people do adapt. So you will find through competition, the rest of it, when you go out and you're procuring products, it'll be amazing by suddenly you'll find like concrete already. You can find net zero concrete providers, whether that's regulated or justifiable, different thing. But you'll suddenly find this will become a thing that to get a competitive edge, people will be pushing and saying, well, actually our product is already net zero. And hopefully that will move forward and actually make that whole issue with Scope 3 emissions and embodied carbon far easier, because it will dealt with early on in the process. Key challenges that I see is however many conversations I've had people, is how do you deal with the existing building stock? It is not easy, and a lot of it comes down to cost, and a lot of it comes down to our interpretation of what is offsetting and how do we go about it. In my mind, the right thing is to reduce the need for energy, so improve fabric, improve everything with the building. But the problem is it doesn't pay back. It has a huge cost associated with it. There's huge risks with moisture and lots of other things that we've been talking about. It is very complicated, and that causes a big issue for actually rolling it out and doing it. A lot of people now are reverting to this heat pump first solution, where you basically just go, let's forget about that problem. Let's just stick a heat pump in, let's reduce our carbon, and we'll focus on other things. Yeah, so thank you. Hopefully that was a whirlwind of information. But
any questions for Ollie?
Good question. So what is coming in and what the industry is trying to push is the fact as contractors and consultants, what we do is we build a building, it's finished, we all leg it. and we want to get away with there as far as possible and as quick as possible. What we need to do is actually understand, once we build a building, how does it perform, how do we optimize it, how do we actually get it running as it should, and we need to analyze that to understand how things work. And then for the next project, you have that information to back up, actually, even though they're said in this, and that also can then feed into models, digital twins, and all the rest of it to help understand. So hopefully that's...
Picking up on that point, Ollie, there's not enough post-occupancy evaluation done, is there, really, in the buildings, and understanding building performance. If we could do that, I think they're performing at a sort of a quarter of what they're designed to. Do you think there's also operationally, and it's a bit of some of the work you've been doing, Phil, is that there's not enough people actually taking local management of their buildings? You know, schools are left on because one teacher's in the building, the office is the student accommodation that's in there. That actually, if everybody had a different mindset, and that's the general public, not the professions, is actually if there was a bit of, you know, you've got to go back to
I think it does, and also
stuff to say turn off and do we did it with litter, you know, you've got to turn the light switches off and stuff.
No, and I think, Eddie, as you will fully understand, I think also there's a real issue with people understanding how to use a building. It's very easy. I mentioned about BMS. So you put these fantastic BMS systems that can do everything for you, and it's all made, but the person looking after the building's got no idea how to use it. He's not trained in how to use it. So then he looks at it and they just manually switch it all off, and then it's just manual on-off because that's all they can do. So there's a huge gap in training and understanding what the client needs, and that's why I'm saying the prefect system is very good, because it's very simple and easy to use, and I think we need to go back to that. And I think that's a danger now. We talk about smart buildings, and we want to put more sensors, and we want to understand the buildings further. Do we end up with just so much information? Again, it gets too complicated. But I do think it's also where AI can come in, where you've got lots of raw data. You don't need to understand metering data, something like AI that can sort it out for you in an easy format without you need to understand how to do macros and all the rest of it will massively help. Yeah, and I think you talk about like the soft landings, POE stuff. The whole idea of that is you have a design team that has spoken to the client, they've come up with a solution that should work for them, the contractor's built it, but then you need to educate the people how to use it. But the problem is people leave, people change, and all the rest of it. And in my mind, I think what we need to do is come up with very easy solutions that people can pick things up easily and understand. The best building is a building where you walk in, you don't need to switch on the lights because you've got good natural daylight, and actually it's a building that kind of virtually looks after itself in a really simplistic form that's designed well, and I think that's the key.
Thank you, Ollie.